Thank you very much, Dr. Drury, and I echo your appreciation for everyone who has made this visit possible. I especially appreciate the honor of the Brigance Forum and the purpose for it and the person whom we honor. And as I looked at a lot of the luminaries in the discipline of communication when I visited the program today, I feel grateful and honored to be among that list, and look forward to sharing with you this evening in terms of thinking about ethical communication and diversity in higher education. Among the many roles I've held across almost 30 years at the University of Colorado system, one of them was serving as Associate Dean in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. Another one was serving as the chair of the Department of Communication. And actually, I started with that Associate Dean role in this conversation. I jumped ahead of myself a little. I refer to an instance for that. But this first story comes from when I was a department chair. And at that point, the college had extra funds that they could use, and they decided to create a postdoctoral fellowship. And they invited departments to nominate persons to get that particular fellowship. So the college committee that was charged with choosing the candidates had two that they really thought were viable candidates. And they decided to go with the person with the least teaching experience. Now, they had not included teaching experience or lack thereof as a criterion for this choice. But at that point, they needed to make a decision about how do we kind of break the tie of these two applicants. So the postdoc, they reasoned, would allow this candidate an opportunity to hone her teaching abilities. Although this approach may seem logical, and actually it is logical, right? The committee neglected to consider other criteria that also could have been logical. For example, the other candidate had a stellar teaching record as an instructor in the college. And she had applied for this postdoc fellowship because she aspired to be in the tenure track. This would have been an opportunity for her to do that. Moreover, this candidate's dossier indicated that her research and teaching focused on race and social class. The other applicant's area was science. Now, given that the campus had a stated commitment to diversity and inclusion, it would have seemed that that could have been a criterion as well, that this is a person who can add to our teaching mission in terms of diversity and inclusion, but the committee did not consider that. This story, and I'll return to it a little later, implies the kinds of issues relevant to what we'll explore this evening. And that is that we need to be more aware of and attentive to the multidimensional relationship between ethics and diversity in higher education in order to really foster and enhance diversity and inclusion. That many of us have this stated mission and goal when it comes to diversity and inclusion. However, we have neglected to think about how are our decision-making processes, maybe inadvertently and unintentionally missing opportunities to truly value diversity and inclusion. So the way I will share this with you is to begin by thinking about ethics in higher education overall, after which I'll talk a bit about this notion of diversity matters. Why is diversity something that's significant? And then we'll turn to this idea of ethical communication with some ideas related to the issues that I've raised. I hope to also then have some time for question and answer. How does that sound?
That's great.
If this was in a classroom, I'd ask somebody to say, so what did I just say? But I trust you all look attentive already, so I trust that you get it. I want to start, as I said, with looking at this idea of ethics in education. And I appreciate these opportunities to come out to other campuses because I am so now far removed from teaching and even doing much research and writing because of the executive role that I have on the two campuses that I oversee. In addition to the University of Colorado, Denver, the downtown campus, I also oversee our medical campus, which has College of Nursing, School of Dentistry, Public Health, Medicine, Pharmacy, and there's one more important one, and don't tell them I left them out. However, my point is that keeps me very busy. It's very gratifying. However, I don't have the opportunity. There are topics that I'd love to learn more about, to go deeper into. And when I get these chances to visit campuses, that gives me that opportunity. This is a book that I found in preparing to be before you today, that if you haven't read it or seen it, I highly recommend. This is written by a internationally renowned moral theologian and ethicist, a Jesuit priest named James Keenan. And he talks about the need to recognize the integral constitutive role of ethics in the formation of a flourishing community for higher education. And for our purposes tonight, we're defining ethics pretty straightforward, of thinking about basic concepts and fundamental principles of decent human conduct, of thinking about ethics as a system of moral principles. So Keenan says that we need to really try to develop the context, climate, and structures to promote a culture of ethics in higher education. And he talks about why we need to do that is because the university doesn't tend to be a professionally relational world. Rather, they're silos, and those silos often are student affairs and faculty or academic affairs. Those silos often can be departments. Perhaps with the unique configuration here at Wabash, you don't have quite those same kinds of divisions, and yet I'm not a gambling woman, but I bet there's some of that because we're all products. Those of us who work here, we're products of other similar kinds of systems. And as a result, we need to think about that. He also talks about, he frames higher ed as a series of fiefdoms with hierarchical classes running across the entire university structure. Going on further to say the university has, it seems, an awkward relationship with ethics. He says, quote, "It teaches ethics for all professions except its own. And the one major professional institution about which you cannot find any ethics courses listed among the hundreds available is precisely the university." So what did I do in preparing for this talk? As I looked at Wabash's website, I Googled ethics, and I found there are ethics courses in many of the professions. And that makes sense. However, I didn't find any evidence that there's an ethical orientation for the university, the college itself. Now, this makes you align with what he's saying, and it aligns with the kinds of institutions that I've had experiences with. He also talks about how this is the kind of history that we've seen in religion, in churches, and also in the medical profession, to the extent that they now have infused an ethical orientation for the work that they do. And this stems, as you know, in particular, for some of the kind of controversies that have arisen in those professions and in those arenas. So basically, he's saying that most of us in the academy are not only not trained to be ethical in the standards we use for a variety of the activities in which we engage, we also aren't held responsible for them except in unique or isolated ways, right? So for example, thinking about students and plagiarism or code of conduct, or thinking about, so you have ethics committees, or you have conflict of interest. I know faculty members, you have to fill out something that you don't have a conflict of interest if you did, for instance, for this, when I came to visit you all, I'm taking vacation leave because I'm being paid an honorarium. So we have those kinds of policies and procedures, but what we don't have, and I actually agree with Keenan's position along these lines, we do not have this kind of professional training and understanding of a lot of things that we do. Let me give you some examples in our roles as faculty and staff and administrators. So these include things like evaluating colleagues or prospective hires, instruction, examinations, interacting with students, maintaining office hours, or even posting what are our office hours, right? That we're all over the map in terms of how we engage in these behaviors. Professional confidentiality, writing evaluative letters for or about others, keeping our contracts, disproportionate salaries, We do not have professional ethical questions about our university investments. Unless something arises, gets some attention, and sometimes students are the ones who call attention to some of these kinds of issues, sometimes maybe not so much. As I say some of these, I invite you, especially the students, but of course my colleagues as well, to think about how much do you know about these issues? How much are they actually based on some ethical kinds of perspectives, except kind of taken for granted, or this is the way we've always done it around here. So we also don't adequately review typically faculty after tenure or when they're given endowed chairs, nor do we hold our administrators accountable in terms of ethical decision making until and unless something happens where it comes to our attention. He also talks about our tendency to have horizontal structures, so that I actually asked my provost, and I know this is being recorded and he knows that I asked him this question, of how do you know that the deans are really holding true to our really strong and important commitment to diversity and inclusion, and to engage in some best practices for how we can actually hire faculty who can help us with our diversity and inclusion mission? And he said, well, I just figured that they are. And one of the things Keenan talks about is that he believes part of what happens in the academy is that we kind of see ourselves, I know I see myself every time I look at myself, it's like being smart, right? And this sort of sense that because you're smart, you'll do the right thing, which is really a fascinating kind of point, and that I think has some value in terms of thinking about how are we dealing with ethics in higher education. And there's also the point of the notion of autonomy and not having accountability except only in certain kinds of things. So he says that we also neglect to really have specific, explicit ways of approaching ethics when it comes to things like sustainability on campuses, faculty or staff unions, university relationships with neighbors, students' rights, sexual health issues, workers' benefits, immigration issues, racial tensions, paid recruiters. So I didn't find any evidence that you may do that paid recruiting of students, but perhaps some of you know that there are actually recruiters who are paid in particular to recruit international students. That brings up ethical questions in terms of even the sense of how are they making those decisions, but to what are they recruiting those students, right? So oftentimes with diversity and inclusion efforts, which are let's get some of them, whoever they may be, but without thinking about what are we bringing them into, right? What's the fairness and the equity and the sense of moral, right, obligations to what do we owe people if we actually successfully get them to be part of our communities? And then there's the dorm life of students. Again, you often have things like rules and policies for the students themselves, right? And you may have boards that students have to come before if there feels like there's been an infraction, but it typically isn't something that's also part of the fabric of the campus overall, which is what Keenan really is requesting for us. And he also says, what about the classism that is experienced by many students unable to keep up with the costs of education? So for me, one issue arose related to this that I think, in fact, I know stems from my own being a first-generation college student and having a sense of having to buy textbooks that I never used, and that was way back in, right, when I was in, and who knows the cost of textbooks now. So that the idea, and I found when I was a department chair that my colleagues were selecting their textbooks, et cetera, and they didn't know how much it would cost the students, right? Now most of what I share with you, in fact, I would say all of it is never intended to point fingers, but rather to hopefully raise questions, to invite all of us to think about what, if anything, am I doing that's like that this becomes an invitation to revisit. So the idea of, remember with ethics being more moral, systems of moral principles, of recognizing, the basic notion of right or wrong, good or bad, but thinking about that according to whom, and thinking about how thoughtful are we really about these kinds of issues. So one very simple thing that I did was I asked faculty to put, and that was a time when the library systems were different than they are now, but I just said very simply, have copies of your textbooks in the library, and moreover, have them where students can take them out overnight. Because sometimes they have them where you can just do for 2 hours, and especially when I got on the downtown Denver campus, this was especially important. However, I realized that that mattered at the CU Boulder campus, where there was this idea of homogenizing the students to say, well, they're all trust fund babies and they're all right. So that kind of assumption actually helped to perpetuate some of these behaviors that, again, Keenan would say, and I agree with him, have strong ethical implications and are places where we can do better for the common good. So other challenges include barriers as well as varying approaches to hiring practices that we don't keep track of. I recall inviting my colleagues to think about, there was an opportunity to hire a scholar who would bring in a particular approach to film analysis, et cetera, that aligned very well with, we have a new branding that's called CU in the City for the downtown campus. And this was a scholar who's doing exciting work on looking at film and, looking at horror movies and looking at Black spectatorship and doing a few other things related to these sorts of issues that are very much about urban experience and so forth. And so I thought that was an opportunity where they said, well, we can't just hire someone outright. And I said, but we appointed this person over here who was this science luminary, right? This person who would come in and bring some grant money, et cetera. That was not a hire that went through the processes. And they couldn't explain to me what really was the difference between the two. And again, I'm not saying there was any malintent, but the challenge becomes looking at Keenan's argument about ethics overall, that they actually become compounded when we start thinking about diversity and inclusion, when we start thinking about the kinds of implicit biases that are built into a lot of work that we do. So what Keenan does is that he and he also says that there are biases in terms of how excellence is defined and sought. There are differences between, he says that we tend to have embedded cultures that privilege existing norms over change. That's the way we've always done it. And ways we've always done it may be appropriate for a century ago, and yet probably can be very different for now. And this is an invitation to look at those. It's not to say we need to change everything, but as we think about ethics, as we think about doing the right thing, we also need to be thinking about how to do the thing right. I like that. Thank you very much. I'll be here until at least 9 o'clock. He also says that we need to, as I said, create an ethical culture that expects accountability and transparency from the top and from the horizons. He says, and I agree, universities should be among the first to reaffirm the importance of basic values, such as honesty, promise-keeping, free expression, and nonviolence, for these are not only principles essential to civilized society, they are values on which all learning and discovery ultimately depend. And Keenan actually does refer to aspects of diversity and inclusion that would be familiar to all of us. He has an entire chapter on gender, talking specifically about women in the academy and the history of women in academy and roles. And if you're not familiar with the data, they persist in terms of even as we have more women graduating in general from college, still when you look across the roles, you look across who has tenure or not, you look at who tend to be the faculty who are not among tenured or tenure track, they will tend to be women. The higher you go up in hierarchies, the maler and whiter they get. And he contends that if we're not paying attention to how that's happening, it's because of the various biases. So he has a chapter on gender, he has a chapter on race, but he begins the book with a very powerful discussion about adjunct faculty. And I looked at your numbers, and you seem to be really unusual in terms of most institutions. In case you don't know, many institutions rely heavily on adjunct faculty. And these are faculty who are lower paid, have a higher load, have different kinds of expectations, and he talks about ethical implications of that. I dug a little further in terms of my argument that these issues matter for higher education at large, as well as when we think about diversity and inclusion, and I found that most of the high percentage of persons who are adjunct faculty are also women of all races and people of color. So you see, there are ways that we can persist with the inequities, however unintentional they may be, because we're not fully examining our practices about ways we're making decisions. So he connects ethics to diversity in important ways that lead me to the next point for me to share with you, which is that diversity matters. Diversity is something that's significant, and there are many significant issues or matters for us to consider. I think that to fully realize the potential of developing, from Keenan's point, a culture of ethics in higher education, we must focus explicitly and comprehensively on diversity. And in a piece called Diversity's Promise for Higher Education, Making It Work, Daryl G. Smith argues diversity represents one of the most dramatic societal changes in the 21st century, with significant implications for American higher education. It is not only shaping higher education, but higher education's role in society. Now, what do I mean by diversity? This becomes even part of the argument about being ethical, is you should be clear on what you're talking about, right? Because if you're making a decision about something, but you haven't specified what you mean, you're relying on people who have the same understanding, and they may or may not. So what I mean by diversity refers specifically to thinking about the various categories of identity, such as gender, race, social class, age, sexuality, ability, nationality, religion, etc., for which all of those categories have labels that will have some kind of hierarchy in terms of society's notion of who do we value more or less. And by the way, that doesn't mean we as individuals believe those values and those labels. However, what it does mean in terms of the potential for both explicit and implicit bias is that can occur. It also means that when we think about our various systems and structures and ways we make decisions, we cannot help but unintentionally rely on those kinds of value systems. So I go back to the example of the persons who made the decision of how are we going to use this extra money to fund a postdoc, that it became a matter of hiring a person who taught science, first of all. I think that was a kind of bias, if you will. And again, this is never meant to say there was malintent on their part. This was just they were deciding, and they made ad hoc criteria for that. And they neglected to see, wow, here's a person who's teaching race and social class in a context, that was a downtown Denver campus of an urban setting, of a setting where we're very proud of our numbers of underrepresented students, et cetera, that they didn't see that. Moreover, we do have that challenge of a high percentage of adjunct faculty are teaching our courses. And so this was an opportunity to hire this person, and actually who had she had won awards as an adjunct, right? So to hire her and therefore say, we value you, and because she wrote a very, I thought, compelling statement about wanting to go into the tenure track. But that didn't happen because the persons on the committee made ad hoc decisions. Can you see where this particular example is going in terms of how might we have gotten in front of that? Would be to have criteria that are very specifically focused on what matters most to us. So it could be something as simple as looking for opportunities to advance our colleagues who have provided service to us otherwise. It could have been a criterion that said, again, especially who will help our teaching mission in terms of we value diversity and inclusion. We will prepare our students to be in a 21st century world and so forth. But that didn't happen because of the ways of doing business, the hiring practices that whoever's in the room has the power to make that kind of decision. So diversity then refers to those various categories, and in particular, striving for equity, as well as thinking about why this notion of equity matters. So many times, one of the things is we really do need to overcome our history of the various isms in society and make higher education a place where all of us are helping to accomplish that. We also, however, need to recognize that higher education is a place where we can either continue in terms of the status quo, or we can make a difference. Because oftentimes, and I would invite the students, I heard some phenomenal stories of students in rhetoric in terms of the growth and development you've made across your time at Wabash. And I'm confident it happens to a lot of other students. Well, part of that is because of the kind of experience you've had here with one another and with faculty and staff of helping to develop you. So especially for traditional college-age students, this is a place where, higher ed is a place where you begin to really become who you are. And we have the sacred responsibility as faculty to really guide you in that direction. To guide you, not to try to force you, but to try to give you the kinds of experiences and encourage you in terms of critical thinking, to expose you to a variety of experiences so you become those persons who really, we're investing in you for our future. And consciously or unconsciously, we can help that maintain the status quo, or we can really encourage you to be those change makers in society in any number of ways. So diversity in higher education, so higher education is a site of promise in this regard. And it often denotes an ethical imperative for providing access to and being more inclusive of those who have not been included historically, or if they are included, it's with this sense of assimilate, it's with this sense of we owe it to you, right? As contrasted with thinking about the value added of encouraging all students and all faculty and staff to recognize that across all of our identities, first of all, we all are heterogeneous. We all are, as I shared with my colleagues earlier, we're all multicultural. So one of the things that I talked about in terms of the various identities that we embody, so I talked about when I was at CU Boulder, some of my colleagues, my white colleagues, would say, well, I mentioned it a little earlier in this talk, well, they're all white, and it's sort of like, yeah, most of them are white, and yet there's distinctions among those students. And just like I didn't want anyone looking at me and thinking they knew who I was because they saw my race and my gender, that I'm so much more than that, that yes, that also matters to me, and so one of the things I did was I invited those students to help me know, who are you, right? What matters to you? And really found wonderful heterogeneity among that primarily white student body in ways that others weren't seeking to understand. And for me, this is key to the notion of diversity and inclusion. It's both striving for those that we have historically excluded to include, but it's also paying attention to those who we've tended to include so that then all of the students are enjoying the richness of their differences, as well as attending to what is the basic mission and vision of higher education. So there's that ethical imperative, and also this has become more pressing. I know you hear it a lot for demographic development. So the most cited population statistics refer, and well they should, to a new majority of persons of color. There's also, depending on the campus, increasing numbers of international students, persons with disabilities. So whereas previously persons with disabilities, as you may know, even K through 12, we are now incorporating them in mainstream education. And many of those students, and rightfully so, are aspiring for higher education. Many campuses have veteran students, some of whom have served our country and may have challenges that aren't visible to us. We may not even know they're veterans, and yet if we're not attentive to their needs of thinking about that as another issue of diversity and inclusion that has ethical implications, we will not have done our due diligence. Many more students are the first in their family to seek a college degree. Also, college-age students are more diverse than any other generation in terms of religious identity. And so, again, these are aspects of identity that speak to diversity and inclusion. So the pool of prospective students as well as faculty and staff. And by the way, colleagues, we have to be mindful that however we are enacting and embodying being faculty and staff, we're helping students imagine or not that they may want to be in the professoriate. So that becomes another key role that we play for the very life of higher education in our country. Diversity also has become crucial for helping institutions to succeed in a global context where educated knowledge workers interact effectively in a wide variety of contexts. And students, if I could get you a loan, I'd ask you, how well prepared do you think you are to go into a wide variety of contexts? Not just, certainly we can think international, like if you go to different countries, but how about certain kinds of areas right in the United States? How about certain kinds of boardrooms or certain kinds of hospital situations or certain kinds of sales places where you go to, you want to sell something to someone, or you're in the operating room and you want to help somebody understand something, and they may look like you, but actually there could be something else going on in terms of, how alert would you be to those kinds of cues that you could communicate effectively. So the point here is that we need to prepare all of our students to succeed in this global context. We also should recognize that research reveals under the right conditions, when you have diverse people as part of anything you're trying to do, and you have a culture where they genuinely feel valued for whatever they bring to that table, innovation, creativity, productivity, sense of belonging, etc., increase. So what all this means is diversity is problem solving, loyalty, being identified with the organization. So diversity then has become an economic imperative and an economic asset. So it's important for me to punctuate these notions of why diversity matters, because I'm concerned that too often our conversations around diversity seem more about let's let these people in because we deserve to let them in, right? And there's going to be more of them, so it's a numbers game, as contrasted with a different mindset that is about who are we, what are we trying to do, and by the way, it's about all of our students, faculty, and staff. And another thing that happens on the downtown Denver campus is that we boast that we have a high percentage of students of color in our undergraduate classes, and every year there's more. And I say, so what? And now what? Do we assume because we have those numbers that, for example, we focus just on race, that students of all races will, we are the world, we are the children, right? That they will find each other and everything will be wonderful? Or especially if we're not attentive to striving to help them truly understand one another, truly see the value all of them add. Because we all come into these contexts already with ideas of our various identity embodiments of how society tends to view us. Whether or not the situation strives to tell us something different is a different story. So the point then is that many institutions of higher ed are dealing with diversity and inclusion, and yet they don't seem to have taken this notion of ethics that Keenan talks about, that I also really think is important. And again, I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you because I think he provides a brilliant perspective that taps into my premise of why we need to value diversity and that diversity matters. So some campuses are now doing diversity strategic plans, they're creating new positions, they're forming task forces, they're doing some training on this part, that part, but not necessarily thinking from an ethical standpoint and thinking systemically about what they're trying to accomplish. Therefore, they may have some successes in this program here, or they may have some successes on, we hired this person, right? But in terms of consistent, specific, zooming back out now to how Keenan critiques the various kinds of decisions we make. What I'm suggesting is thinking about the decisions we make, specifically focusing on diversity and inclusion. And a way to think about these issues, because the notions of diversity and inclusion often focus on recruitment and retention of diverse students, faculty, and staff. And again, diversity can mean different things depending on the campus. They also focus on admissions. They focus, as I said, on inclusive curricular. They focus on marketing. Now, I'm gonna give a reference that may not be culturally responsive because it may be outdated. Does anyone know the TV show Scrubs? Yeah. Oh, yay! Right on. So reruns, or how does that work? Or were you like a little kid, like a toddler? Oh, okay, middle school. So remember Turk, the African-American physician or physician, said that when he was in undergrad, that the marketing materials for his school actually photoshopped him twice in a crowd for their marketing materials. So this notion of marketing really has ethical implications in terms of, are you marketing and saying, right, so maybe take the 3 women in science and you have them in a lab, right, and say, this is who we are, right? Or you see where I'm headed with that. That there are ethical implications. So some people will say, well, this is aspirational, and these really are our students, right? And yet the likelihood of people looking at that. So anyway, I'm just trying to offer you a few examples of places, exciting opportunities where we can do better when it comes to these issues. So the intentions really are important. The intentions toward diversity and inclusion, but we've got to be more thoughtful, and there really are ethical implications of what we're doing or not doing. So one thing to consider is a concept that is a diversity affirming ethical orientation that prescriptively promotes diversity in our actual decision making, so that Antoinette Aragon and Edward Brantmeyer coined this word diversity ethics, which is premised on the principle of diversity affirmation, or the idea that difference and multiplicity are positive, good, and beneficial to the institution, to society, to humanity, and to the planet. Now, in doing so, they do not delve into the topic in the ways that I do, which is we've always got to be thoughtful as we strive to include those who have been excluded, that we're not inadvertently seeming to exclude those who have been included. So this is where the definition of inclusion is crucial. So when we talk about diversity and inclusion, inclusion refers to the basic notion of everybody, right? Everybody counts, everybody is valuable, we respect everybody. You should have a sense, no matter who you are as a student on this campus, that this college anticipated you were going to be here, and they're glad that you're here. So any kind of interaction you have, if you're in a course, if you go do a transaction, et cetera, you have this sense that you're valued. So that's inclusion, it's every single body. Inclusion also should focus explicitly on those who have been excluded. But you've got to be, again, careful that in your zeal to include, you neglect to think about those who are accustomed. So one of my analogies is, imagine a family that's in a particular culture, and there are 3 children, and there are 2 parents, and they're all the same, as kind of homogeneous in whatever aspects of identity you might think about. And the 2 parents decide, you know what, I think it's going to be helpful for our family if we adopt a kid from a different culture, whatever that may mean. In fact, let's adopt a couple of them, right? But they don't include the children in the discussion. They don't tell the children, we're going to do this because I think we're going to be better as a family. I think that, back to the notion of why these issues matter. So suddenly, these kids who are accustomed to being the center of their parents' world, who have taken that for granted, who enjoy their lives, suddenly there are these other kids, and these other kids are getting like different kind of food because that food matters to them, Or, parents are really trying to make those kids feel especially welcome. So what can happen then to those children who are already there? And they're, especially because they're so comfortable and accustomed to being the children in that context. So our notion of diversity and inclusion and a diversity affirming ethics has to be inclusive and expansive in that way. And Aragon and Brandtmeyer enjoin us to consider that if our decisions were guided by diversity ethics, deliberations about what is right or wrong would actually focus on how, if at all, might this decision help us advance our commitment to diversity and inclusion? How might that help us in that regard? And then they have some questions that say we should be striving to view diversity as something very positive and valuable, rather than something that feels like burdensome, feels like a problem we've got to address. That's important for everybody in these situations, because unintentionally we can be reinforcing for our students and our colleagues that we're accommodating certain categories of students, for example, or we're trying to hire certain kinds of faculty members. We're trying to advance women because, our accreditation, or we want to look good to other institutions, as contrasted with, again, if you have people who are coming in with different perspectives in terms of anything that you do, and you really value them, you can be more effective for your bottom line, whatever your bottom line is. But by the way, I also strongly believe we should be valuing diversity because it is the right thing to do. We should be valuing diversity because we should value all humans, and all humans should have a sense of respect, even as it's important to share with people the variety of these perspectives. So they say, let's ask questions like, do we value what is different, or do we want to assimilate it? Do we understand the limited nature of our knowledge paradigms and how they are historically and contextually constructed? Do we actively seek out and integrate the diversity that just might be vital for institutional and societal sustainability? So this diversity ethics framework, I believe, has strong potential for affecting change in higher education, for us to really optimize who we are and what we're contributing to not only our country, but also the world. And one approach to that, in addition to diversity ethics, is ethical communication. And what I mean very simply by communication is ways that human beings share meaning with one another. So that's anything from what we're doing here. If you took a picture of this scenario, you think most people would have a sense of what's going on here, right? That brilliant person dropping serious knowledge, okay? That because we have been socialized to understand what sharing meaning means in different kinds of contexts. And now more than ever, we have so many options for how to share meaning with one another. So that's what I mean very simply by communication, ways humans share meaning. And ethical communication is really referred to the idea that's expressed in the ethical credo of the National Communication Association, which says that questions of right and wrong arise whenever people communicate. Ethical communication is fundamental to responsible thinking, decision making, and the development of relationships and communities within and across contexts, cultures, channels, and media. And the principles of ethical communication, they're actually no different than any principles of ethic. They include truthfulness, fairness, responsibility, personal integrity, and respect for self and other. One of the things I did, I was teaching a critical thinking course, and I invited students to give their definition of respect. What is it like for you to feel respected? And I actually, full disclosure, part of why I did it was to kind of appear like cool. That was back in the day when I actually brought in my boombox and had Aretha Franklin singing. What did she sing? You want to hit it? Sing it for you. Yeah. What else? I know that you would. But I actually played the song, and I said, so what does respect mean to you? What does it look like? How do people treat you? And I was really surprised, and this is back at CU Boulder again, with the sense that people said they're all alike, of the different definitions of respect, right? That some I think had to do with gender differences in terms of respect, some I think had to do with generational differences, some I think had to do with other kinds of cultural differences. But my point is, when we think about ethical communication, we think about diversity ethics, that some of the concepts we routinely rely upon, and we say, let's respect each other, it really depends on according to what that means to you. How many of you know the golden rule? What is the golden rule? What they said, right. Do unto others as you would have others do unto you. Does anyone know the platinum rule? Do unto others as they would have you do unto them. And this gets at the differences that we as human beings can bring to engaging with one another. And there isn't necessarily a right or a wrong way when it comes to that, but it's important to try to have an understanding of that. So even as we talk about respect, we need to understand what might that mean? And that requires that we engage with one another to find that out. So they say, Brandtmeyer and Aragon say, to achieve these principles, we need to promote communication climates of caring and mutual understanding that respect the unique needs and characteristics of the various persons who are part of our concept. So this means that we need to have the will and the ability to listen carefully, to pursue and practice mutual respect, to invite reciprocity and inclusiveness, and to live openly and responsively with the dialectical tensions that are inherent in commonality and difference. And that is, again, a place where we have what it takes of thinking about critical thinking, of thinking about the notion of dialogue, the idea of re-examining our practices. So now this is a story of when I was an associate dean. One of my duties encompassed serving as the ad hoc chair of the ethics committee for the undergraduate advising office in the college. So this is also an example of where we do have mechanisms in place related to ethics in the academy, but they're specific and focused. And across several cases, I noticed a pattern of students from a particular country being charged with plagiarism. And I intentionally will not tell you that country, because even repeating it is one way of potentially reinforcing those kinds of stereotypes. But as I listened to the background of those cases and I listened to some of the students, I thought that there may have been some cultural differences in terms of one student in particular talked about from that culture, when you share information from another person, that's a sign of respect. But I also figured out that our colleagues were not quite as basic as I'm going to share with you in terms of saying to students, don't plagiarize, but it was almost just that basic. Instead of helping students really understand, here's what that means, here's what it looks like, here are the consequences. So some of the students didn't even realize you could get suspended. And for some of our international students, that could mean really like the end of their college careers. But it turns out, with the idea of the institution taking the responsibility for these issues of ensuring that if a case of what appears to be plagiarism occurs, we feel we've done due diligence to really give examples of what that means, of what it looks like, and here are the consequences, as opposed to, most of us would agree, well, if you plagiarize and it looked like you did, then you suffer the penalties. But if we haven't thought about cultural distinctions, I actually have found that some of our first generation students don't often come understanding to the depth that we may assume they should of what some of these kinds of issues are. And for me, that's an ethical situation. And so I remember that for me, writing a report for school was going to the shelf and getting Encyclopedia Britannica. Anyone know what that is? And just copying that and turning it in, right? Now, did I learn differently? Eventually, yes. And does that excuse me if I, didn't follow convention? No. But what it says is we need to be responsible for that we've addressed those issues. And I actually brought this to attention because it really seemed in one of our units more than the others. And those faculty had become so really focused on these students for this particular country, that their implicit and explicit biases were beginning to show themselves in how they were treating those students. And so that's an ethical issue, where faculty really believe they're doing the right thing, and they know that students shouldn't engage in plagiarism. I think I've made the point, but this becomes another example of ensuring. However, it's also up to an upper level administration and to ways that we evaluate one another. We hold each other accountable, but we also have those systems and structures in place. So back even to that decision that was made about who to hire for the postdoc fellowship, if we, and I've said this already, but it bears repeating, if we had the kind of policies and procedures where we've thought in advance about, well, what are our criteria? And we agree that this is what we're going to use, and we stick to them, that becomes an ethical approach that also aligns with what we say are our mission, vision, and values, whatever those may be. And of course, what you see I'm saying is I think we should focus especially on diversity and inclusion. So let me wrap it up and talk about how Reverend Keenan says, one, he actually has in his final chapter, he says, if I were a president of a university, and he maps out everything he would do, and good for him, and good for if there were a president or someone who's in charge who would really want to take what I like to call a strategic, systemic, and sustainable approach. So he has great ideas. If you're interested, check them out. But one of the places we immediately, I think, can enter this conversation and we can make a difference is what he talks about is bridge building. And he talks about solidarity, forging interpersonal relationships between and among diverse constituencies who recognize the need for one another. And it's one of the things that I shared in the interview this afternoon of encouraging you as students to really take advantage. First of all, for you all to recognize, I bet you know it already better than some of us, that you are heterogeneous, that there are differences among you. And yet, how, if at all, are you actively and proactively engaging across those? How are you really striving in the relationships that you have, that this is like a living laboratory? As you leave here and go out into the world, you can't help but encounter a lot of different kinds of people. And again, some of those people may look like you, and yet they can be different. And many of those people will not look like you, right? So there's an idea of solidarity. And this call to solidarity from Keenan is born out of the awareness that certain social structures impede relatedness among dependent groups of persons. And this now is to my faculty and staff colleagues. When you think about the kind of horizontal organizational structure that is part of, that characterizes higher education. So faculty, horizontal. The chair supposedly evaluates, but then what is that really based on? The thinking about the searches for hiring, thinking about evaluation, thinking about all the issues he raises, there's an opportunity for us to strive for ethical communication. And one very simple approach is dialogue rather than debate, of being willing to keep communicators focused more on mutuality and relationship, and in this case, on striving to become more robust and thoughtful and intentional around diversity and inclusion, that we're open to looking at how we do what we do in order to affect the change that we'd love to make. Levi Strauss executive Marvin T. Brown says, if we connect ethics and diversity through a creative dialogical process, we can discover how our different assumptions, observations, and value offer significant resources for doing whatever it is we're trying to do. We're trying to create a better mousetrap, all right? Are we trying to figure out social change? Whatever we're trying to do, we really create those kinds of situations where we do the kinds of things that are grounded in assumptions, but assumptions about we really strive to value one another. We really strive, right, to respect. But we also have to understand what does that mean for one another and so forth. So he says we can discover how they make a difference for what we do, and then we trust that we can truly value diversity and inclusion. he also offers some questions. Do we value what is different, or do we want to assimilate it? Do we understand, oh, I said that already about the limited nature of what we do and so forth. So with that, I want to close with just a few recommendations of thinking about, first of all, what is your commitment as a college to, first of all, ethics? And what is your commitment to diversity and inclusion? And how might any of the kinds of approaches to decision making we've talked about, is there room to visit them and see what, if anything, you might do differently? I think we should acknowledge, justify, and communicate this need by striving to understand differently and better. What's working, what's not working? How actively do you strive to understand your colleagues? How actively, students, do you strive to understand one another? We can't actually respond to a dilemma if we don't even realize that it exists. We don't even realize, for instance, back to that, I never would have known, right, when they made that decision about who to hire as the postdoc. I was just puzzled because I thought we had made such a positive case for that young woman, who, by the way, Metropolitan State University of Denver on that same campus did hire her in a tenure-track position, and she's doing extremely well. She earned tenure there. So that was our loss, quite frankly. It was higher education's gain. She still found her way, but that's something that we should be ashamed of as far as I'm concerned. And I wouldn't have even known it had it not for me being to call and for my colleague to be very straightforward about, oh, we did it this way. And I said, if only you had thought about it in a different way. So there are lots of things to do. Start with yourself, regardless of your role. Try to understand what are your places of privilege and power, and how, if at all, are you using that for good? Not to feel ashamed of that, but really to feel, well, how can I use that for good? Who might I be able to reach? Because, for instance, for me as being a straight person, who might I be able to have conversations with or affect policy for LGBTQ issues because I'm straight, right? Not to see it as a place of shame. Create an ethical and inclusive culture. Cultivate ethical communication, like what are our criteria for determining rightness and wrongness? What values ought to guide decisions? Research shows something very simple of when you work with groups who are making decisions, if you just invite them, let's try to be fair, rather than let's not be racist, let's not be sexist, let's not be, right? That if you say, let's try to be fair, that goes a much longer way, because most people are going to want to try to be fair in whatever they do. So I close with you with a quote from Keenan, who says, as we reflect that the time is now to raise the right questions about ethics in the university, we must remember that making ethics means making community, and that the first step towards developing university ethics on our own campuses will be to appreciate that the university is more than its president and the faculty, even as we recognize it is the president and the faculty, and it's also all the rest of us. And to get connected then, we should push for university ethics that makes us a true university system for the 21st century. Thank you. So that's my time. I don't know if you wanted to try if there was a question or not, but I also always want to respect people's time. So what do you think?
Yeah, we can open it up if there are a few questions. We understand if people need to leave.
Definitely, yes. Hey.
So growing up,
Sammy.
Growing up, I went to a predominantly white school growing up, and then Wabash obviously is all male.
Yes.
So what are your recommendations for people who, have kind of been in similar situations as me, as far as valuing diversity, groups of people that we might not have had interactions with in our high school, grade school, and college years. Mm-hmm. But I know that we will once we get out into kind of the quote-unquote real world.
Yes.
So what are your recommendations, for people like that who have just for whatever reason or another not been around certain groups of people?
Thank you so much for that question, because that's a dynamic we really have to be conscientious about. So it starts for me with us as faculty and staff in these situations of what, if anything, have we done so that we recognize you come with that as your background, and have we tried to optimize it through assignments, through examples, and so forth. So that's one part of it. However, now with you getting ready to go out into the world and recognizing that, I would say there's work that you can do on your own, which includes a few things. For one is, if you haven't gone through any kind of implicit bias training, that there's some really good work in that, which helps all of us recognize how likely we really are to have implicit biases. It has nothing to do with our hearts and our value systems. That the media does quite a job on us in terms of homogenizing certain groups, that if you haven't had direct one-on-one interaction with certain groups, you're going to draw upon how has the media depicted those persons. So the work on implicit bias, for instance, in the medical community finds that a lot of medical students really believe that African Americans have a higher tolerance for pain than white people. So if they come in believing that, what does that say for treatment, say for so many different kinds of things, right? So doing some research along those lines, I think also but really opening up to exploring and moving outside of whatever may be your comfort zone to engage and understand. And sometimes that can be as simple as something I do, which is consume media that's different than what I kind of see as my preference, right? So whether that's looking at documentaries, as well as even either certain kinds of genres, et cetera, and then looking to finding, for instance, as you go into your new life, kind of looking around you and trying to get a sense of where might there be areas for me to learn and to grow. I think it begins with where you are, which is acknowledging that that's something you want to grow in, and then being conscientious and intentional, but however, not approaching something like that where you almost exoticize another person. It becomes, I want you to be my friend because I don't know many people like you. Not that people would be that explicit, but sometimes in their really quest to try to meet people, that can be a dynamic that's well-intentioned. But I think that that's something to think about. And does anyone else have any suggestions for Sammy for the question he just raised? Yes.
Yeah, I think at least as a senior now, looking back, there were so many missed opportunities just to talk with guys that had different views from me in the classroom and to follow up with them afterwards. And it's like a safe space here at Wabash in general, and you can go and seek those people out and just sit them down and have coffee with them, or even the people you agree with, but the people outside of your fraternity, outside of your sport. There's so many guys on campus that are diverse in other ways, and they have different experiences than you have, and you see those in the classroom, but you have to seek those out outside of the classroom and outside of your sort of groups that you find yourself in for great reasons. But
that's really powerful advice that I say goes for everybody. That it's back to that idea of oftentimes members of dominant groups had this sense, I want to meet from non-dominant. It's vice versa as well, because all of you will be going out into situations where this notion of people different from you and same as you is going to prevail. And the better equipped you are of seeing this almost as, again, like a learning laboratory where you're engaging, where you have that commonality of being Wabash, right? Of that identity that I have a sense that most of you take very seriously, and it means a lot to you. So that's where you already have common ground from which you can then engage across any ways that you are different. Thank you so much for that. Yes?
Is this a realistic goal, though, for a larger institution?
Mm-hmm.
Because it's here, it's more likely to be able to take place just because you're not considered to be just a number. There's no more than 1,200 people on this campus.
Yes.
But when you start getting into larger campuses that have more issues happening, there's a possibility of trying to implement this as an issue that should be addressed, and then it gets swept by the wayside because there's other issues happening.
Yes.
How realistic is it that this could happen at large scale campuses?
Another excellent question that you've begun to respond to, which is part of it, is the basic premise of looking at your context and figuring out how do you optimize it. So you can optimize the fact that you're small. I can optimize that I oversee 13 schools and colleges, by helping to implement specific kinds of programs or to support those. So one of the offices that I oversee, the Educational Opportunity Programs Office, they actually created something that they call, it's CCC, and I've forgotten what the 3 C's stand for, cross-cultural conversations or something like that. And they've done a brilliant job of bringing groups together. They bring in speakers, et cetera, and it was easy enough to give them the resources for that. And there are many, and our student government is really committed to diversity and inclusion. For the 4 years I've been in this role, the students who ran for student government came to me to talk with me about how can we optimize. It wasn't quite the same question that you posed, but it was related to, they realize we need this in order to be effective as we go out into the world. And so how can we optimize that? So that becomes a reason why we can do those kinds of programs. Our faculty, our outgoing student presidents actually submitted a petition to our faculty assembly that asks that all faculty are trained in culturally responsive teaching because of the varying experiences they had, and they didn't feel as if they'd been prepared. And our faculty assembly, to their credit, says, okay, you're right, and now they've come to us at administration to say, you need to fund this. We need to do it right. We also have a group of faculty who has said they want, as one of their criterion for being evaluated, that there's a question, and so far we have a very broad, basic question of how, if at all, have you worked on diversity and inclusion. We're also looking at course evaluations. Oftentimes, if there's a question about diversity and inclusion, it's sort of just vague. Or there's one we have that's like, did this instructor pay attention to gender and racial ethnic diversity? It's like, what does that even mean? Did I call upon a black student in class? Yeah, well, you're good to go. So it's back to that idea of being thoughtful and systematic about whatever you do in those processes. So yes, it's realistic. However, it's gonna be challenging, and it has to take, as I've said before, strategic, systemic, and sustainable, where you not only are holding people accountable, but you're really giving them the resources. It's not fair to say to faculty, make your courses more inclusive. It's sort of like, okay, where do I even begin with that? How do I do it? I'm afraid students might think that I'm racist or sexist or that I'm pushing an agenda. I don't necessarily know how to do that, but we've got to provide the resources to help them to do that. So, and it also on our downtown campus in particular, part of why we're beginning to see success, and I think we will continue, is because we do have those relationships between student affairs and our faculty. And it's also, these processes are a way to give credit where it's due to many of our faculty and staff who go above and beyond with these issues, but for whom, when they get evaluated, it doesn't count. I remember when I was at CU Boulder and I got involved with a lot of women's issues and a lot of issues related especially to black students. And I got an award from the Black Student Alliance. And there were only 2 other black women faculty members, and one of them came up after, she said, that's not gonna count for anything. I had my little plaque and I was all happy. She said, that's not gonna count for anything. Even as, here's another ethical issue, we recruit people to say we want to diversify, but what does that really mean, right? We anticipate, one of the things that happens is let's have more, on campuses that have women, let's have more women in certain kinds of roles like sciences so that the women students can kind of see themselves as scientists. Or let's have faculty of color so those students of color can see. Well, it really ought to be more about all students can engage with a variety of people in different roles than it is for that, but it also often becomes the case that that doesn't get valued. And by the way, we want you to be that role model, we want you to mentor students, we need at least one of you on all of our committees, so you need to be on the committees, right? And yet that counts for nothing. And at the end of the day, for me, to get tenure and promotion, I needed to have published, I needed to have done certain things, even as I was getting awards for teaching and getting awards for blah, 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 being invited to serve on the President's Committee for Title IX, et cetera, that stuff just didn't count enough. I drifted away from the question, but it's about being systemic and strategic and thoughtful in terms of the ethics of how we do what we do. Yes. Hi.
Sorry, Josh, last question.
You're very welcome.
As you know, you mentioned in your talk how students are an integral part of this.
Yes.
How do you approach not necessarily the problem, but the instance or just the realization that your student demographic is changing every 4 years?
Mm-hmm.
Where
Another.
in a place like corporate America,
Yes.
it's probably easier to
Yes.
do a long-term snapshot.
Yes.
And have people staying with you
Mm-hmm.
for 20, 30 years, but that's not the case now.
That's another excellent question and challenge that we must deal with. And it stems from, on every campus I'm familiar with, there are student leaders. On every campus I'm familiar with, there are students who want to go above and beyond their coursework. So how about we strive to find ways that how students do that aligns with these issues? And how, if at all, are we even building it into coursework? Are we building it into experiential learning? Are we building it into something as, I don't know, do faculty here ever give extra credit for anything? Barely? But students, let me tell you a secret. I could have a course where you can earn 10,000 points in the course, and I would say you can get 2 extra credit points if you do this thing, and students would run off to do, anyway, just saying. That this is where faculty could come into play. We think about how do you incentivize and how do you encourage students, because that's one of the things I say to those students on my campus who are doing this phenomenal work. They developed that resolution, right, for faculty because they saw the need, is for one, part of that student governance work is also work study, right? So that there's an incentive there, even as they really are striving to be leaders. Helping students understand, if you have something like that on your CV, or you can talk about to employees that you're bringing this kind of experience. So we've got to help you understand what's in it for you that can sometimes align with, you already might be someone who's an advocate for social justice. You might already be concerned about these issues. So one is we've got to help you know that's valuable, that's important, we encourage and support you, and then we can figure out ways to do that. So my office has discretionary funds for students, faculty, and staff to do any kind of experience that aligns with our diversity mission. And our mission is very expansive, diversity and inclusion. So as I said, gender, race, class, age, ability, veteran status, religion, all of those categories and their intersections. So if a group of students, we had a group of Native American students who, or not even just Native American students who are advocates for Native American rights. So let me be clear that this means any student who wanted to go to to the UN, to a conference, then we support that. And then they had to come back and give a little report on what that experience was like. So there are ways we can work together with you as students. So thank you for that question.
I have a statement, not a question.
Okay.
Years ago, I was coaching one of the admissions officers, a colleague. He said, "Boy, I go to the cafeteria, and I really don't like the self-segregation where all the black students sit here.
Mm-hmm.
Why don't they separate, sit with everybody else?" I said, "That's awful white of them." I suggest that if you see Chinese students or Arabic students, and you're white, you don't want to go by yourself, go by with a friend and say, "Can we sit here?"
Mm-hmm.
And if you reject it, then you know how it feels.
Mm-hmm.
Keep going until, don't let the minority group that clusters together for protection. You have to be assertive in breaking that up.
Thank
That's
you.
my statement.
Thank you very much.
Well, there's certainly a lot to think about. I wanted to conclude, sorry, Mac, I preempted the applause.
Go for it, Mac.
Mentioning, so the namesake for the lecture, the Brigance Forum lecture, was named after longtime professor of speech, William Norwood Brigance. He taught here from 1922 to 1960, and he was very much interested in the connections between rhetoric and democracy in thinking about how do we use communication to make a better world.
Yeah.
And so I think that Dr. Allen's talk is clearly within that long tradition. We're also graced this evening with Jack Ost, who is Dr. Brigance's grandson, and so he's joined us this evening.
Thank you.
And so hopefully you've taken something away from this to think about how we can go out in the world and make it all a better place. So thank you very much for joining us.